The date is July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong is wearing a suit that weighs 180 pounds in Earth's gravity. The temperature outside the suit was actually pretty mild. NASA was smart enough to land during the lunar sunrise when temperatures are around 20 Celsius. Nevertheless, there is no atmosphere, there is no wind, and no sound at all except the hiss of his own oxygen supply. He has just climbed down a 9-rung ladder on the side of a spacecraft called the Eagle. He is standing on the bottom rung with his left boot hovering above the lunar surface. He pauses there for a moment. Back on Earth, an almost inconceivably long distance away, 240,000 miles, 530 million people are watching. That is roughly 1 in every 7 human beings alive at that moment, all sitting in living rooms, gathered around TVs and shop windows, or crowded into town squares, all staring at a grainy black and white image of a man in a white suit on an alien world. Neil Armstrong is about to say something that will be quoted for as long as human beings tell stories. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Or at least that's what he meant to say. What the world actually heard was slightly different, but we'll get to that. What I want to start with, and what I think gets lost in the mythology of that moment, is everything that came before it, and everything that came after it. Because Neil Armstrong was in almost every respect the most extraordinary, ordinary man of the 20th century. A man who did the most remarkable thing any human being has ever done, and then went back to Ohio and planted corn. This is his story. Welcome to Venerable Lives, the podcast where we examine the single defining moments that turn people into the figures history remembers. I'm your host, Thomas, and thank you for joining us. Neil Alden Armstrong was born on August 5th, 1930, in a small farmhouse near Wapakoneta, Ohio. And I want to hold that word for a second, Wapakoneta, because this is not a city. This is not even much of a town. It's a dot on a map in western Ohio, surrounded by flat farmland in every direction. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the biggest event of the year is the county fair. But here's the thing about Wapakoneta. It sits roughly 55 miles from Dayton, Ohio, where in a bicycle shop in 1903, 2 brothers named Wilbur and Orville Wright built the first airplane. Whether that proximity was a coincidence or destiny is not something I can answer, but it's definitely hard to ignore. By the time Neil Armstrong was 6 years old, he had already been on his first flight. His father, Stephen Armstrong, was a state auditor who traveled frequently for work, and on one of those trips, he took his young son to the local airfield to ride aboard a Ford tri-motor passenger airplane. It was a lumbering, noisy thing called the Tin Goose. It was also, for the 6-year-old sitting inside of it, apparently the most significant experience of his young life. Well, what did he do after that? You see, he went home and he built a wind tunnel in his basement. He was 6 years old and he built a wind tunnel to test his model airplanes. Young Neil already had it all figured out. His mother, Viola, later recalled that Neil was different from other children. He was quieter, more self-contained, always absorbed in something. He read voraciously. He built model planes with obsessive precision. He was fascinated by telescopes, partly because a neighbor owned a particularly powerful one and would let the neighborhood kids take turns looking through it. His family moved around Ohio a lot, 16 different towns by the time he was 14, following his father's work. You might expect that might make a child rootless, anxious, and unable to settle. In Neil's case, we can interpret it seems to have had the opposite effect. He got very good at watching and very comfortable with his own company. By the time he was 15, he had saved enough money from odd jobs, mowing lawns and working at a bakery, to begin taking flying lessons at the local airfield. He received his student pilot certificate on his 16th birthday. His driver's license came later. Yes, you heard that right. Neil Armstrong could fly a plane before he could legally drive a car. He enrolled at Purdue University in 1947 to study aeronautical engineering, with his tuition paid by the U.S. Navy under a scholarship program. It was a deal with a condition attached. After 2 years of study, he had to serve 3 years in the Navy. So in 1950, at 20 years old, and with the Korean War just underway, Neil Armstrong reported for flight training. He flew 78 combat missions in Korea off the deck of the USS Essex. His plane was the Grumman F-9F Panther, a jet fighter, and on his 7th combat mission on September 3, 1951, something went very badly wrong. North Korean forces had strung a steel cable between two hills across a low-altitude reconnaissance route. Armstrong's aircraft hit that cable at roughly 350 knots. It sheared off 6 to 8 feet of his right wing, compromised part of the aileron, and damaged his elevators. The plane was still flying, but barely. He managed to climb to a safe altitude, fly to friendly territory, and eject. He had never ejected before. By some accounts, in the seconds before pulling the handle, he was quickly reading through the ejection procedure in the cockpit. After Korea, he finished his degree at Purdue and went to work as a test pilot at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics High-Speed Flight Station at Edwards Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert. And this is where the story gets almost absurdly impressive. Over 7 years at Edwards Air Force Base, Armstrong flew more than 200 different types of aircraft. He flew new jets, experimental rockets, and bizarre prototype machines that had never left the ground before. He flew the X-15, a rocket-powered plane that looks like something out of science fiction, capable of reaching nearly 4,000 miles per hour and altitudes above 200,000 feet. That's the edge of space, and Armstrong took the X-15 there. And through all of it, all of the emergencies, all of the near misses, and all of the moments when lesser pilots would have panicked, Armstrong was known for one thing above all else: his calm, his almost natural ability to process a crisis without letting emotion take control. He was not reckless, he was deliberate. There was a difference. Colleagues who flew with him and worked alongside him at Edwards consistently described the same quality. The worse things got, the more deliberate Armstrong became. And that deliberate quality would save his life and his crewmates before he even ever got to the moon. In 1962, Armstrong was selected as a member of the second group of NASA astronauts. He was 32 years old. He spent the next few years training, and in March of 1966, he commanded his first ever spaceflight, Gemini 8. The mission had two main objectives. The first was to perform the first docking in space history, connecting the Gemini capsule to an unmanned target vehicle called the Agena, and the second was a spacewalk by his crewmate Dave Scott. They pulled off the docking without a hitch. 6.5 hours into the mission, Armstrong eased Gemini 8 into the Agena target vehicle, and the two spacecrafts locked together. History was made. And then, 27 minutes later, to Armstrong and Scott, the world started spinning. A thruster on the Gemini capsule had gotten stuck in the open position and was firing continuously. The two docked spacecrafts began to roll, and then the roll became a spin, and then the spin accelerated. Within seconds, Armstrong and Scott were rotating at 1 revolution per second. 60 full rotations per minute. Both men were on the edge of losing consciousness. Their vision was tunneling and they couldn't read their instruments. Armstrong had to make a split-second decision fast. He undocked from the Agena. The logic was sound. He assumed the stuck thruster was on the Agena, not the Gemini. But the logic was wrong. The stuck thruster was on the Gemini, and now, freed from the Agena's stabilizing mass, Gemini spun even faster. Armstrong then did something that required both deep training and extraordinary presence of mind. He shut down the entire orbital attitude and maneuvering system, all 16 thrusters, and activated the re-entry thrusters, a separate system normally reserved for re-entering Earth's atmosphere. It was outside normal mission protocol, but it was the only thing that worked. The spin slowed, then stopped. Armstrong and Scott were alive, but using the re-entry thrusters meant the mission had to be abandoned immediately. Mission rules were clear. Once re-entry thrusters are fired for any reason other than re-entry, you come home. They had used approximately 75% of their emergency fuel. They splashed down in the Pacific Ocean 10 hours and 41 minutes after launch. NASA investigated the incident and Armstrong was cleared. The initial decision to undock from the Agena was deemed reasonable given what he knew at the time, and in the debrief, those who reviewed the mission noted something. Throughout the entire emergency, Armstrong's voice on the radio had never wavered. So, 3 years later, NASA decided to give Armstrong the most difficult mission of all, to land on the moon. To understand what was at stake with Apollo 11, you have to go back to a speech. It was May 25, 1961. President John F. Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress and said something that, at the time, seemed genuinely insane. He said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." At that moment, the United States had put exactly one human being in space for exactly 15 minutes. The Soviets had already put Yuri Gagarin into full orbit. America was behind, publicly and humiliatingly, in what the press was calling the space race. But let's be honest, it wasn't really a race, it was a proxy war. The Cold War was fought in rocket fuel and television cameras. Every American spacecraft that exploded on the launch pad was a propaganda gift to Moscow. Every Soviet achievement, first satellite, first man in space, first spacewalk was proof, or so the Soviets claimed, that communism produced better science. Kennedy's challenge was insane precisely because it was so specific. Before this decade is out, that was a deadline, and by 1969 the decade was almost out. The America that was watching Apollo 11 in July 1969 was not a united country. It was a country ripped apart. Martin Luther King had been assassinated the year before. Robert Kennedy had been assassinated 2 months after that, and the Vietnam War was consuming American lives and the American faith in its institutions. And yet, on the evening of July 20th, when Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, something strange happened. The world, albeit briefly, agreed on something. Even in countries that were rivals of the United States. In the Soviet Union itself, where state television had not broadcast the launch, popular demand forced them to eventually show coverage of the landing. That is what Neil Armstrong took a step for when he stepped off that ladder. Not just a moment in history, the moment in history. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969 from Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The crew was Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Buzz Aldrin. For 4 days they traveled to the moon, and on July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module, a spindly, ungainly-looking craft called the Eagle. They separated from Collins, who would then remain in orbit above them in the command module. What followed was 12 of the tensest minutes in the history of human exploration. As the Eagle descended toward the lunar surface, an alarm started flashing. 12:02. Neither Armstrong nor Aldrin had seen that alarm in training. It was a computer overflow warning. The onboard guidance computer was being asked to do more than it could handle and was shedding lower priority tasks to keep up with the critical ones. Back in Houston, Mission Control had just one chance to get this right. A 24-year-old engineer named Jack Garman had prepared a handwritten cheat sheet of every possible alarm code. He looked at the sheet and he told Mission Control, "Go! Keep going!" And they kept going. Then Armstrong looked out the window and saw where they were heading. The pre-programmed landing site was heading directly toward a crater, West Crater, the size of a football field, and filled with boulders the size of cars. There was no way to land safely there, so Armstrong took semi-manual control. He flew the Eagle, searching for a flat patch of ground. Every second he flew costed precious fuel. From Houston, capsule communicator Charlie Duke radioed up a warning. 60 seconds! 60 seconds of fuel remaining in the descent tanks. Armstrong found a patch of ground. Aldrin called out altitude and the descent rate. The dust being kicked up by the engine was obscuring their view of the surface. 30 seconds. And then Aldrin said two words that ended the longest 60 seconds in human history. Contact light. The probes hanging from the Eagle's landing struts had touched the surface of the moon. Armstrong's hand moved to the engine shutoff. They had landed with somewhere between 15 and 50 seconds of fuel remaining. Buzz Aldrin has said 15 seconds in multiple interviews, but NASA's post-mission analysis calculated approximately 50. The true figure is somewhere in that range, and frankly, either number is extraordinarily close to disaster. At 4:17 in the afternoon Eastern Time, on July 20th, 1969, Armstrong spoke into his headset. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." In Mission Control, the room exhaled. Charlie Duke, trying to respond, momentarily couldn't get his words out, and when he finally did, he said, "Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." I believe the exhilaration of the moment is captured in this most. Duke himself said he was so excited the word tranquility came out as twangility, and I think we've all had those moments. There was supposed to be a rest period before the moonwalk. Armstrong and Aldrin were scheduled to sleep for several hours after landing. Neither of them could sleep, and honestly, who could blame them? They requested and received permission to start the moonwalk early. Armstrong suited up, opened the hatch, and began to crawl out onto the porch of the lunar module. He deployed a television camera folded into the side of the aircraft so that people watching from Earth would have something to see. Then he descended the ladder. He got to the bottom rung and stood there for a moment, his boot hovering over the lunar surface. He had prepared a line. He'd thought about it during the journey. He stepped off the ladder and... "That's one small step for a man and one giant leap for mankind." At least that's what he said. What most of the world heard was, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Without the article. Without the A. It made the sentence grammatically odd. Man and mankind mean the same thing. The contrast disappears. Armstrong spent years quietly, never making a fuss about it, but insisting that the A was in there, lost in the static of a 240,000-mile transmission. "The A was intended," he said at the 30th anniversary gathering in 1999. Decades later, although still disputed, audio analysts ran the recording through software that didn't exist in 1969. They found evidence, a 35 millisecond gap consistent with the spoken article suggesting that Armstrong was right. He said "a man," the most consequential missing syllable in the history of human communication may not have been missing at all. Nevertheless, he spent 2 hours and 31 minutes walking on the surface of the moon. He collected rock samples. He took photographs. He planted an American flag. And the plaque Armstrong and Aldrin left behind read, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all of mankind." Then, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed back into the Eagle, rejoined Collins in lunar orbit, and began the journey home. On July 24th, 1969, the Apollo 11 command module splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The crew was recovered by the USS Hornet, and then did something that is almost comically mundane given the circumstances. They cleared U.S. Customs. The three most famous men on the planet filled out a general declaration form. Under cargo, it listed moon rocks and moon dust samples. And under departure point, moon. I should add that the customs check is often cited as ceremonial, but it was filed as a government document nonetheless. So after all of that, they immediately went into quarantine. It was not a formality. NASA genuinely did not know whether astronauts returning from the moon might be carrying something. Maybe some organism, pathogen, or biological agent that had never encountered Earth's biosphere. The quarantine lasted 21 days. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins spent it first in a converted Airstream trailer on the recovery ship, and then in the Lunar Receiving Laboratory in Houston. And finally, after all of that, after the moon landing, the customs check, and the quarantine, the world wanted its heroes. And for a time, Armstrong gave them what they wanted. He, Aldrin, and Collins embarked on a 38-day goodwill tour around the world. They visited 22 countries across 6 continents. They met heads of state and were received by crowds larger than anything since the end of World War II. More than 100 million people saw them in person. Neil Armstrong smiled. He shook hands and he gave speeches. He was by all accounts gracious and patient throughout. So, what did he do after? Well, he went home to Ohio and tried to disappear. In 1971, Armstrong retired from NASA. He took a position as a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati in his home state and bought a farm near the town of Lebanon, Ohio. He raised cattle, he grew corn, soybeans, hay, and wheat. He turned down endorsement deals with an almost principled consistency. He didn't write an autobiography. He gave almost no interviews, and he didn't appear on the lecture circuit, even though he could have charged an astronomical fee. In the 1990s, he discovered that his autograph was being sold online. Collectors were paying significant sums for it, and some people were approaching him specifically to obtain his signature for resale. So, he stopped signing things altogether. When his barber sold his cut hair to a memorabilia dealer, Armstrong threatened legal action unless the proceeds were donated to charity. In 2005, he gave a rare interview on 60 Minutes. The host asked him directly whether he was uncomfortable with his fame, and he smiled. "No," he said, "I just don't deserve it. Circumstance put me into that particular role." And he really meant it. That's the thing that's hardest to fully absorb. This was not strategic modesty. He genuinely believed and said repeatedly in the limited interviews he did give that the moon landings were a collective achievement of thousands of people, and that elevating him specifically, singling out his footprint above the contributions of the engineers, mathematicians, and machinists who made the mission possible, was a distortion of the truth. Like I just mentioned, Armstrong never wrote an autobiography, but starting in 2002, biographer James R. Hansen spent 3 years conducting 55 hours of recorded interviews with Armstrong, the most extensive authorized account of his life ever produced. The resulting book, First Man, is the closest we will ever get to Armstrong's own voice on these questions. Neil Armstrong died on August 25th, 2012, following complications from heart surgery. He was 82 years old. His family released a statement that said, Neil Armstrong was a reluctant American hero who always believed he was just doing his job. And then they added one more thing. They asked people to mark his passing with a gesture. On the next clear night, go outside, look up at the moon, and wink. I've been thinking about why Neil Armstrong matters so much beyond the obvious, beyond the fact that he was the first human being to stand on another world, beyond the mission and the quote and the photograph of the bootprint. I think it's this. We live in a time that is almost uniquely obsessed with visibility. Every algorithm we interact with is built around the same core assumption that achievement without recognition is incomplete. That if you do something extraordinary and don't document it, promote it, and monetize it, you've left something on the table. Neil Armstrong was the perfect refutation of that idea. He did the most remarkable thing any human being had ever done. The first frickin' human to walk on the moon, and then spent the next 43 years insisting it belonged to everyone else. That it wasn't his to monetize, and that the footprint mattered more than the foot. You know, I think there's a version of this story where you could call that naive, where you say the mission cost taxpayers billions of dollars. The country needed a symbol, and Armstrong had an obligation to be what the world needed him to be. There's something to that argument. But there's another version, a version where Armstrong looked at what happened on July 20th, 1969, and understood something that almost no one else in his position could have understood. The step was small, and the leap was mankind's. That one person standing at the center of history doesn't mean that that person is the cause of history. He grew up roughly 55 miles from Dayton, Ohio. He built a wind tunnel in his basement. He flew 200 different kinds of aircrafts. He survived a spacecraft spinning at 60 revolutions per minute. He landed a lunar module on semi-manual control with less than a minute of fuel to spare. Then he became the first person to walk on the moon. After all of that, he came home, planted corn, and told anyone who asked that he'd just been in the right place at the right time. Maybe that's humility. Maybe it's wisdom. Maybe it's just who Neil Armstrong was. The same person at 82 that he was at 6, staring out of a small plane called the Tin Goose, somewhere over western Ohio, thinking about what came next. That is our story for today, and I think we should all, on a clear night, look up at the moon and wink. I know I will. Thank you for listening to Venerable Lives, the podcast where we examine the single defining moment that turned people into the figure history remembers. I'm your host, Thomas, and if this episode moved you, share it with someone who loves history or someone who needs a reminder that the walk is the thing, not what comes after. If you enjoyed it, please follow and rate this podcast on all podcast platforms, and feel free to subscribe to our free newsletter where we cover what is coming next, and also find our social media links at venerablelives.com. Until next time.